Super Mario Galaxy is probably the greatest game in history to ultimately owe its existence to a bizarre, gimmicky controller made out of colored plastic. And no, I'm not talking about the Wii Remote. That's a bizarre, gimmicky controller made out of white plastic. What I'm talking about is this. These are the DK bongos. They were designed to be used with a then kind of obscure and now really obscure rhythm game called Donkey Konga, released in 2003. In which players would pound the drums and clap in time with a collection of songs like Shining Star by Earth, Wind & Fire, We Will Rock You by Queen, and Rock Lobster by the B-52s? So in addition to being the only Nintendo-published game I'm aware of which contains lyrics about somebody's earlobe falling off, Donkey Konga also has the distinction of being the first Donkey Kong game since 1994 to not have been created by British developer Rare, whose last ape-related effort had been the 3D collectathon platformer Donkey Kong 64 in 1999. So you might ask, how did our pal DK go from globetrotting adventure to doing covers of novelty new wave songs in some seedy jungle bar over the span of 4 years? Well, that's because Nintendo could no longer count on Rare's support for Donkey Kong, or any other franchise, as it was no longer a free agent, having been acquired lock, stock, and barrel in 2002 by the up-and-coming video game juggernaut, Microsoft. Rare's new owners were happy to let it put out a few smaller projects for the Game Boy Advance. After all, Microsoft didn't even have a portable console that these games could poach sales from. But as far as major home console releases were concerned, Nintendo was on their own, and in the short run, this was pretty much the best idea they could come up with. Despite being responsible for the original Donkey Kong, which was one of their biggest hits ever and established an American market for them almost by itself, Nintendo had never really shown a serious flair for making games starring the Big Ape. Their 1982 sequel, Donkey Kong Jr., wasn't anything close to the sensation that Donkey Kong had been, and Donkey Kong 3 was an outright flop. Their 1994 Game Boy reimagining of the original was pretty good, and quite successful, but its star quickly faded in the light of Rare's extraordinary Donkey Kong Country. And ultimately, the Game Boy Donkey Kong didn't even sell as many copies as Rare's portable outing, Donkey Kong Land, which came out the next year. By purchasing such a legendary studio, Microsoft was showing the world how it intended to secure the high-quality exclusive games that every console manufacturer depended on to drive sales, a strategy straight out of the Silicon Valley playbook which it would follow for the next 20 years. If you can't beat 'em, buy 'em. Nintendo had spent almost 2 decades building up the capacity to make great games, but with its mountains of cash, Microsoft could simply buy whole studios with a similar level of experience, then put them to work making exclusive games for the Xbox. As long as they managed their new talent skillfully, Microsoft could grow to be just as big a player as Nintendo in a fraction of the time it had taken Nintendo to grow to that size naturally. Now, in retrospect, we can see that Microsoft didn't really manage its acquisitions all that well, Rare being a perfect example. But that was a long-run development. In the short term, Microsoft was catching up to Nintendo's position by leaps and bounds, and in fact, the Xbox would ultimately outsell the GameCube, leaving it to languish as the least successful home console to survive the 6th generation. This was a generation in which Nintendo faced probably the toughest and most sustained competition on 2 fronts seen at any time before or since. Microsoft was buying studios and licensing deals left and right, and at the same time, Sony was building off the massive success of the original PlayStation, leveraging its superior understanding of hardware, strong relationships with third-party developers, and a respectable lineup of first-party studios. In the face of all this, with strong third-party support for the GameCube a forlorn hope, the team at Nintendo was forced to pull back and polish up their first and second-party offerings until they gleamed. And to be fair, for the most part, they did a pretty good job, with one glaring exception: Donkey Kong. Without Rare on their side, Nintendo was at a loose end regarding what to do. This was their only major franchise that had previously owed most of its personality to an external partner. They simply didn't know how to mimic the very Western, in-your-face style that had made Donkey Kong Country such a blockbuster. It wasn't their thing, it was Rare's, and if the legacy of Donkey Kong was going to be carried forward, they would have to do something to reclaim it and impose a new identity on the long-running franchise. With this in mind, Shigeru Miyamoto suggested not only creating a brand new team to make the next Donkey Kong game, but one that would work in an entirely different environment from what Nintendo was used to. Which is to say, not a different office environment, but a new place altogether. What Miyamoto was proposing was a branch office in the legal, financial, and to a certain extent cultural capital of Japan, Tokyo. Nintendo's hometown of Kyoto lies about 230 miles southwest of Tokyo as the crow flies. But this is a bit misleading, because the cities are separated by several mountain chains, and travel between the two was never easy until the Shinkansen connected them in 1964. And partly as a result of this, the cultural distance between Tokyo and Kyoto is vast. While Kyoto is by no means a small city, it's also older, more traditional, and more self-consciously Japanese, while Tokyo prides itself on being a high-tech cosmopolis where all the world's cultures are on display. Nintendo didn't necessarily try to keep influences from Tokyo out of their games, but as a result of their location, they naturally didn't get a lot of key employees from that area when they first started making games. Their high-ranking designers didn't always come from Kyoto, of course, but the ones who didn't tended to be from near neighbors like Osaka and Nagoya. However, by the mid-90s, a new generation of talent was beginning to emerge that was more Tokyo-centered. Yoshiaki Koizumi hailed from Shizuoka, about halfway between the two cities, while Katsuya Eguchi and Hideki Kano both grew up in Chiba, just a few miles away from Tokyo. Eguchi was actually born there. And perhaps more importantly, Nintendo's strategic partners were heavily concentrated in the capital city. Satoshi Tajiri, the creator of Pokémon, grew up in Tokyo, and his company Game Freak was headquartered there. Camelot Software Planning, who were responsible for Mario Golf and Mario Tennis, worked in Tokyo. So did HAL Laboratory, the creators of Kirby, who had such a strong relationship with Nintendo that their former president was now running it. So having a new in-house branch of Nintendo in Tokyo was far from an outlandish idea. It would give them fresh concepts for new games, help them to liaise with the external studios whose work they were now really depending on, and expand the pool of talented university graduates they could hire from. This last one was especially important, because up to this point, Nintendo had insisted that all of its new hires move to Kyoto as a condition of employment. And as much as Nintendo fans might like to believe that it would be worth any sacrifice to be part of the greatest game company in the world, the fact is that there were lots of potential Nintendo employees who didn't really want to leave Tokyo and all its perks behind. Nobody could tell in advance if this experiment would pay off or not. The only thing that was close to certain was that games made by this new Tokyo team were going to be pretty different from what had come before. This was certainly true of their first big project, Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, a fairly complex 2D action platformer with several different gameplay modes, all controlled by a device that was designed for a rhythm game, containing 3 buttons in total, one of which was just a sensor that registered when the player clapped. On paper, this concept looks not just crazy, but actually impossible, yet somehow the team made it work. And the key was something that had been a trademark of Nintendo's since Super Mario 64, contextual prompts. Playing each of the bongos separately makes DK move left or right, and playing both at once lets you jump, while clapping serves as a way to grab collectibles and stun enemies. But these moves on their own wouldn't be enough to make the game playable. DK's real secret weapon is his ability to grab various objects and stunned enemies simply by approaching them, at which point a very short cutscene plays of him grabbing hold. He can then attack to send enemies and projectiles flying into the distance, swing and bounce off of platforms, or hold on and be carried somewhere. All of these moves depend on what DK is holding, not what buttons you press, and that allows Jungle Beat to have platforming challenges that at least seem complex, even though most of them boil down to timing a single button press correctly. Even though I bought and played Jungle Beat back when it first came out, I'm frankly not a huge fan of it. In broad terms, it's a very simple game, but the level of ingenuity it displays is almost objectively impressive, and I have to respect it for that. It manages to combine elements of an endless runner, a Mario-esque 2D platformer, and yes, a rhythm game, in a mostly seamless way, coming across as far more professional and seasoned than the vast majority of newly founded game studios in any era. Whether or not Donkey Kong Jungle Beat was a hit, it was obvious that this team had a future. Which is a good thing, because in the end, Jungle Beat was kind of a commercial flop. I mean, really, what did they expect from a 2D platformer in the mid-2000s, where the barrier to entry was buying a giant plastic set of bongo drums? There's not a lot of overlap between die-hard Donkey Kong aficionados and people who invite their friends over to bang on plastic drums while singing Losing My Religion in a fake Michael Stipe voice. But luckily for Nintendo and its fans, EAD Tokyo's next big project, while it carried over way more design elements from Jungle Beat than were strictly necessary, would still be less of a watch me design this game with my hands tied behind my back affair. It would be far more ambitious, and far more successful, a symbol of Nintendo's persistent efforts to break out of the third-place status that the PlayStation 2 and Xbox had forced it into. With EAD Tokyo's next project, Nintendo was shooting for the stars. While the team responsible for Super Mario Galaxy got its start making Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, conceptually the game owes its existence more than anything else to a tech demo called Super Mario 128, which Nintendo showed off at their Space World trade show in the year 2000. In Super Mario 128, which only lasts a minute or two, A circular platform resembling a game board is shown to ripple and warp as a succession of little Mario homunculi pop into existence on top of it. These little Marios, 128 of them by the end of the demonstration, run around, jump, pick up and throw boxes, and just generally fool around as the terrain they walk on becomes more and more treacherous, until by the end they can barely stay on it. This was intended to be a demonstration of the GameCube's capabilities, but it would be more accurate to say it was what they hoped they could eventually do on the GameCube. Some of the demo's concepts were figured out fairly quickly, like having dozens of on-screen characters with individualized artificial intelligence. This is the key mechanic of Pikmin, which came out just a year later. But others, particularly the manipulation of terrain and Mario's realistic physical response to it, would have to wait years and years to be successfully realized. Part of what was seen in Super Mario 128, the idea of resisting gravity, reappeared in The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. It's what's behind the magnetic walls in several areas that Link can walk on using the iron boots. More interesting, though, was the related concept of spherical movement, having a character travel all around the surface of a sphere as if it had its own gravity, and the implications that such a platform could have for the design of a classic platformer series, like Super Mario. Change the word sphere to planet, or planetoid, which isn't much of a stretch since part of what defines a planet is its mostly spherical shape, and voila! You have the primary level design element and essential gameplay hook of Super Mario Galaxy. Planetoids come in all kinds of shapes and sizes in Galaxy, but the one thing that most of its levels have in common is that the play area is curved to a greater or lesser extent, and that this curvature gives rise to new platforming challenges, as well as new ways to solve or even finagle your way around these challenges. The difference in level design on its own would have made Galaxy feel quite different to play than 64 or Sunshine, but this is far from the only general change. In fact, if Mario had kept his moveset from the first two 3D Mario games in Galaxy without any changes, the result could have been a disaster. Yoshiaki Koizumi noted early in development that positioning Mario in midair above the surface of a planetoid is surprisingly tricky, which is a problem in a series where you often want to, jump on top of enemies. In Galaxy, even when you have a fairly firm grasp of the game's mechanics, trying to jump on every enemy generally results in your misestimating the distance between them and you, bumping smack into them, and taking damage. And this is where the team's prior experience with Donkey Kong Jungle Beat served them well. Jungle Beat had the same basic dilemma that Galaxy did. Because Donkey Kong's movement was imprecise, being controlled by repeated bongo hits rather than simply holding a direction down, if he had to land on top of enemies to defeat them without taking damage, even fairly skilled players were going to end up taking a lot of damage, and that wouldn't seem fair. So combat in Jungle Beat was reworked to be more about stunning enemies by clapping, a move which had an area of effect, so you could do it from a safe distance. Then you just had to approach the enemy, at which point DK would grab it and give you a chance to strike. There was still challenge involved in this, but it was largely a matter of timing your approach and making sure you stayed away from enemies that you hadn't managed to stun yet. Galaxy accomplished something very similar with the spin technique, which dazes most common enemies and lets you defeat them merely by running up and automatically punting them into the stratosphere. I think it almost goes without saying that this is also very satisfying to see in action. This lowers the difficulty of combat just enough to keep it from getting frustrating. Mostly. But at the same time, it doesn't trivialize the threat that enemies pose to you. Curiously enough, spinning not only replicates the combat function of clapping from Jungle Beat, but also its platforming functions, just translated from a 2D to a 3D context. Take launch stars, for instance. These are level elements that fling you toward a distant planetoid when you spin near them, acting similarly to warp stars from Kirby, except that the camera follows Mario as he travels. The launch stars are responsible for most of the impressive visual set pieces in Super Mario Galaxy, but fundamentally they're just a way of connecting parts of the level without those parts having to be right next to each other. Jungle Beat had something quite similar. Take a look at this little monkey guy hiding in a tree. If you clap next to him, he'll throw you in the direction of the arrow, and you can use this to traverse vast distances in a few seconds. It's not exactly the same, but you can see how one of these concepts could grow out of the other. If you clap next to a coconut that's been thrown at you in Jungle Beat, DK will grab it and prepare to toss it right back. In Galaxy, spinning next to a coconut, and yes, it is still a coconut in this game, will make it rebound on the enemy that shot it out. Spin while you're in range of a Koopa shell in Galaxy, either on the ground or underwater, and Mario will scoop it up, in the same way that DK grabs things like bananas when you clap in Jungle Beat. The major difference between mechanics in the two games is that Jungle Beat has nothing but these contextual moves, making it dependent on level gimmicks to keep things interesting. Because Super Mario Galaxy was the latest in a series of 3D platformers, not a brand new concept, it was able to take these new moves and incorporate them into the more robust running and jumping moveset that was already highly polished and established, with most of the kinks worked out. If I had to describe Super Mario Galaxy's gameplay in one word, it would be smooth. There's a certain effortless suavity to his movements here. Even when the game is difficult, Mario generally looks like he's barely breaking a sweat. There's less of the constant pratfalling and bumping into things that was so prevalent in 64 and Sunshine. But this is partly because the levels are less dense with stuff. The arguable downside of taking Mario into space and having him zoom across planets is that the vast scale and fast pace tends to trivialize each individual planetoid as a virtual place. In almost every aspect of design, Galaxy is a compromise between two very different visions. On the one hand, the example of 64 and Sunshine, which focused on large worlds that invited exploration, and on the other, the example of Mario's 2D Golden Age, in which each stage was just a loosely themed collection of obstacles, to be forgotten as soon as the next stage came along. Even the mission structure underlines this division. Where 64 and Sunshine had half a dozen or more major objectives per world, Galaxy has only 3, even for its larger galaxies, with only one hidden star that isn't a simple variation on an earlier mission. Even though its missions often feature unique planetoids, increasing the perceived size and complexity of the level, there just isn't as much depth as there used to be. Sunshine in particular emphasized the individual identity of its 7 worlds, to the point that while I'm playing it, I sometimes stop going after mission objectives entirely and just mill around talking to NPCs because I'm enjoying being there. I rarely get that feeling in Galaxy. Sometimes there's a hint of it in places like the Space Junk Galaxy or the Gold Leaf Galaxy, but I'm probably just being charmed by the quality of their art assets and how well they're put together. These are very pretty levels, and I enjoy looking at them, but they're not deep in the way that even the least fleshed out world in Sunshine is. This is a necessary consequence of its scale. If Sunshine had 3 dozen levels to play through, they would be just as shallow. Now, given my feelings about immersion and quality over quantity, you might expect me to consider this a fatal flaw in Galaxy, which puts it definitively below Sunshine on whatever scale I use to compare these things. But while I do have quite the soft spot for Sunshine, this isn't the case. I love both of these games to death, and I couldn't possibly pick one over the other. There's 2 reasons why I'm not upset at Super Mario Galaxy for being a compromise between depth and immediacy. One is purely practical, and this is that a compromise was exactly what the Mario series needed in 2007. Like it or not, Super Mario Sunshine was not the hit Nintendo had hoped for back in 2002. It sold respectably, but Mario games were supposed to be blockbuster system sellers, and even by GameCube standards, Sunshine wasn't exceptional. By way of comparison, Super Mario 64 sold almost 12 million copies on a console owned by around 33 million people, meaning more than a third of N64 owners bought a copy. There were just under 22 million GameCube owners, so you'd expect Sunshine to sell about 2/3 as many copies as 64. Actually, it sold just under 6 million copies, meaning its attach rate was about 26%, a whole 10% lower than Super Mario 64's. I may be a bit of a contrarian crank, but I'm not such a curmudgeon that I would want one of my favorite series to suffer financially just so it could stubbornly stick with the design approach that I happen to like personally. Unless it's Zelda, obviously. But the second reason has a lot more to do with why I love Super Mario Galaxy. You see, even though its levels aren't incredibly deep, and it never tries to tell a complex overarching story, Galaxy is really good at a particular kind of small-scale storytelling, largely because of its mastery of that nebulous thing called mood. Throughout its 4 decades of existence, Mario has never been a particularly story-focused franchise. But there are a few basic story threads that link most Mario games together, giving at least the impression that Mario's character and the world he lives in have been consistent over time, however deceptive that impression might be. The backstory of Mario is that he's a human being, originally from the real world or someplace like it, who turns up in strange fantasy worlds and is called upon to save them from an evil menace. He's not a superhero, but not quite an ordinary person either, frequently shown to be more physically powerful than Bowser, despite his diminutive stature, on top of his phenomenal jumping ability. This simple character portrait touches on a pair of archetypes that are commonly associated with Mario, those of the hero and the adventurer. At first, these may seem identical, and they are often portrayed together in a single character, but their shades of meaning are subtly different. A hero is someone who protects the innocent, makes right what is wrong, and defeats evil, while an adventurer is someone who travels to distant places and does exciting things in them, often learning about the native culture and history in the process. Heroism gives a story dramatic stakes and a sense of importance, while adventure makes it more interesting and adds depth to the setting and characters, so they complement each other well. Heroic stories without much adventure in them, like Beowulf for instance, strike a lot of readers as dull and excessively heavy, while an adventure story with characters who aren't heroic, like Candide, can feel pointless and unsatisfying from a dramatic standpoint. I mean, Candide is satire, so it's supposed to feel that way, but you get my point. There's a reason no one ever made a big-budget movie adaptation of Candide. I would also say that the Mario games tend to favor one of these two archetypes over the other. Super Mario World and Super Mario Sunshine lean more on the side of heroism, with chapters being defined by rescuing one of Yoshi's friends, or cleaning the goop from a specific corner of Isle Delfino. Then in other entries, like Super Mario Bros. 3 and Super Mario 64, the focus shifts to adventure, and Mario spends relatively little time saving the day. Super Mario 64 is an especially interesting case. Even though there's a fair number of NPCs in the game, Mario isn't often called upon to help them. More commonly, the opposite is true. It's the Bob-omb buddies and Toads who help Mario out by giving him access to cannons and power stars. Mario doesn't even rescue the Toads from Bowser's clutches before talking to them. Apparently, they all managed to get free without him. Mario's heroics in this game are pretty much confined to rescuing that one penguin baby, fighting Bowser 3 times, and saving Peach at the end. This is one reason why 64 and Sunshine feel so different, even though they have more in common with each other than any other 3D Mario game. It's because their stories evoke different emotional responses in the player. 64 is lighthearted and meandering. Mario doesn't have to do anything specific in Peach's castle, except find enough power stars and beat Bowser. The manual tries to raise the stakes by suggesting that Bowser is turning the inhabitants of the painting worlds into monsters, but this tease at heroism doesn't land, because nothing in the actual game reinforces it. These painting worlds look pretty much the same after you're done with them as they were when you started, and some, like Big Boo's Haunt, feel like they were never exactly good or peaceful to begin with. It's hard to imagine anyone in this story depending on you, except for Princess Peach herself. And then we have Sunshine. Despite its upbeat title, Sunshine is heavy from the outset. Mario gets accused of ruining Isle Delfino and driving the Shine Sprites away. He's thrown in prison. NPCs act huffy and indignant and yell at you when you talk to them. And to clear his name, Mario doesn't bother to draw the locals' attention to the fact that in every respect other than size and shape, the perpetrator looks and acts nothing like him. No, he just keeps his head down and tries to be helpful, and eventually wins his way back into their hearts. There's an almost crushing sense of responsibility that permeates the events of Sunshine. Mario has to clean up the island, because he's the only one who can use Flood. He has to protect the Piantas and Nokis, because they're, no offense, a bunch of hapless idiots constantly landing face first in piles of goop. And this is reinforced by the necessity of doing almost all the missions in every world, a much more restrictive and demanding approach than 64 took. It's a very idiosyncratic concept to base a Mario game on. I happen to like the story possibilities it opens up, but I can totally see how it would grate on the kind of player whose first love was Super Mario 64. It's too heavy on the heroism, and doesn't spice things up enough with new locations and characters, or in other words, with adventure. Super Mario Galaxy's secret sauce is precisely that it restores that adventurous feel to the series, without entirely abandoning the heroics that were central to Sunshine. Even though it has fewer missions in each galaxy than 64 did in its worlds, the team worked much more consciously to tie the missions together, while 64's missions usually feel completely unrelated to each other. And the result of this attention to detail is a collection of little self-contained stories that feel sort of like tall tales in space. To show you what I'm talking about, let's take a look at the second major galaxy of the game, the Honey Hive Galaxy. In its first mission, Mario encounters and befriends the bee people who live on the largest planetoid of the galaxy. One particularly memorable set piece sees Mario climbing all over the queen bee's body to pick off the pieces of a launch star, which both opens the way to the next planetoid and earns Mario a commendation from the queen for being a good worker bee, or in other words, learning how to effectively use the bee mushroom, which is this galaxy's central mechanic. Mario's new alliance with the bees sets up the premise for the second mission, in which an army of pinch bugs from a nearby planet invades the bee kingdom to take it for themselves. Mario climbs a tower which they've taken over, and defeats a mini-boss to claim the star, And this leads into the third and final mission, in which the leader of the pinch bugs, angered by Mario's interference, swoops down to finish the fight himself. In a climactic boss encounter, Mario uses the bee mushroom again to fly above him and ground pound him into the dust, which causes the third star to show up. Now, there is nothing deep or ambitious about the story being told here. You don't get a 3-page lore dump telling you why the bees and the pinch bugs fight each other, or how Bug-a-Boom grew so big and powerful, or where the bees got the idea to create a magic mushroom that can give a human bee powers. It's just a basic story about a peaceful village that gets invaded and a hero who saves the day. But because you're personally involved in the story and can see it unfold right in front of your eyes, it's still exciting and gets you pumped to see more. It's simple, but effective. Unlike in 64, where barely anything happened to the levels, or Sunshine, in which things seem to happen almost at random and when you weren't around, in Galaxy the levels go through changes that you directly cause, and that feels pretty good. I'm not as big a fan of Galaxy's main plot as I am of the little vignettes you see in individual galaxies. Essentially what happens is that Bowser discovers how to use star power, and uses it to, big surprise, invade the Mushroom Kingdom and kidnap Princess Peach. Mario tries to rescue her, but is thrown into the depths of space by Kamek's magic, also implied to be star-powered. He wakes up on a planetoid, where a trio of strange star children play tag with him, and eventually lead him to their mama, a woman named Rosalina, who possesses immense knowledge of the stars. Rosalina tells Mario that Bowser's armada is using stars that were stolen from her home, the Comet Observatory, which is stuck in orbit around Mario's home planet after losing its power. She sends him after one of the grand stars that provided the main power to her ship, at the same time entrusting him with the care of one of her Lumas, who gives Mario the power to spin. Mario retrieves the grand star, the first of several which will enable the ship to travel farther and visit more galaxies where new power stars can be found. From this point on, no major events occur in the main plot until the very end of the game, when Mario has obtained enough stars to take the Comet Observatory all the way to the center of the galaxy, where Bowser is holding Peach hostage. The plot in Super Mario Galaxy is another example of compromise between the Mario extremes. It isn't as bare bones as the one from Super Mario 64, but at the same time, it doesn't have any shocking twists, like the reveal of Bowser Jr. in Sunshine. Rosalina is a popular character who's reappeared many times in the years after Galaxy came out, but her popularity doesn't have anything to do with drama or a strongly defined personality, which I would argue Bowser Jr.'s does. Rosalina is a woman of few words and rarely displays emotion. Most of the hints you'll find about her backstory come from a series of optional cutscenes, in which she reads to the Lumas from a storybook, which is implied to be an account of her own childhood. And in fact, just like Rosalina's storytime segments, almost all of the character interaction in Super Mario Galaxy is minor and optional, and this reveals one of the few downsides of its compromising something-for-everybody approach. It means that while almost anybody can enjoy the experience, the only people who are really going to love it are people who enjoy a little of everything: novel gameplay mechanics, challenge, aesthetics, and storytelling, both through dialogue and environmental design. Galaxy is good in all of these areas, maybe even great, but it isn't truly outstanding in any of them when you compare it with other games in the series. This is something that a few prominent critics have taken Galaxy to task for, and these critics have an ally within Nintendo itself: Shigeru Miyamoto. To hear Yoshiaki Koizumi tell it, Miyamoto was put off by the idea of giving Rosalina a backstory, and almost axed the idea completely. He wanted the team to focus almost exclusively on gameplay, because Mario doesn't need a story, a sentiment I've heard echoed most closely by Matthew Matosis, back when he was actually making review videos during the Bronze Age. In his review of Super Mario Galaxy, Matthew Matosis expressed considerable annoyance at the game occasionally tearing him away from whatever galaxy he was in to be told about some development in the Comet Observatory, like Luigi showing up after Mario rescues him, or the Toad Brigade assembling their spaceship to travel alongside Mario through the cosmos. On balance, I wouldn't say the game does this all that often, and even if you don't care, it wastes at most a minute of your time, far less than a mediocre cutscene or extended dialogue sequence would. But from Matthew's or Miyamoto's perspective, what I might call the unimmersed perspective, wasting any time that could be spent on advancing toward the next challenge is inexcusable, because it's avoidable. You don't have to tell the player that Mario's brother showed up in the Comet Observatory, so why would you? Well, you would if you wanted Galaxy to feel like it had a proper story, because Luigi and the Toad Brigade are some of the vanishingly few things that connect Galaxy's universe of wacky worlds together and makes them feel like part of a single extended adventure. In Galaxy, you're not the only person chasing after power stars. In fact, almost everybody who does anything in Galaxy's plot is interested in them. Bowser begins the game by stealing them, Rosalina wants to get them back, Mario searches for them, and Luigi and the Toad Brigade go on their own quests to find more, several of which are successful. If you're invested in Galaxy's story, tissue thin as it is, seeing the Toad Brigade appear for the first time in a new galaxy makes you smile. These are your friends who give you advice and a boost toward the next objective, the only comforting presence in the vast, unfeeling depths of space. And if that doesn't mean anything to you, then yeah, I understand why Galaxy probably isn't your favorite Mario game, or even your favorite Super Mario Galaxy game. I can imagine a version of Galaxy made strictly according to Miyamoto's standards. There would be no Rosalina's storybook, no interruptions to the flow of gameplay, nothing but the galaxies themselves, and a 20-hour-long stream of highly refined and exquisite gameplay. There probably wouldn't even be any NPC dialogue, because who needs to talk to people when you're busy riding the mechanical wave? A game like this would be aesthetically appealing, full of visual whimsy, and a blast to pick up and play, while also offering a hefty dose of rewarding challenge. And it would bore the absolute stuffing out of me. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. The fact that Super Mario Galaxy's design is something of a compromise between the 2D and 3D entries in the series makes its legacy in the overall Mario series difficult to judge, since it takes a lot of inspiration from both of those types of game, and it's sometimes hard to tell what's an innovation and what's simply a minor tweak on an existing concept. So for the purposes of this series, we'll stick to what we know. Another complicating factor is the existence of a direct sequel to this game, Super Mario Galaxy 2, which for obvious reasons contains many of the same challenges, enemies, NPCs, and so on as the first game. I tend not to count things as legacy-worthy if only one subsequent game used them anyway, but in this case I'll make the rule explicit. If it only reappeared in Super Mario Galaxy 2, it doesn't make the cut. Galaxy's most important contribution to storytelling in Mario, like Sunshine's, is a character rather than a plot element. In this case, Rosalina, the Watcher of the Stars. Like practically everything in Galaxy, Rosalina's design is rather simple, but appealing and evocative in its own way. I especially like how the game shifts between presenting her as a normal human being who just happened to fall in with the Lumas, and then as some kind of cosmic spirit who never ages and is able to touch the heartstrings of the universe and all that jazz. Is she actually two characters in one? Is her appearance at the end of the story just a vision Mario is having? Or some kind of telepathic communication? Who can say? It's cool, that's what's important. Another thing I like about Rosalina is that she represents a new wrinkle on the old concept of Mario visiting kingdoms with a monarch who rules over a particular fantasy race. Princess Peach and her Toad attendants were the only example of this in the mainline Mario series for a long time, with even the various kings in Super Mario Bros. 3 all being served by Toads, instead of each one having unique NPCs. The Mario RPGs went in some interesting directions with this concept, but it didn't recur in the main series until the appearance of Rosalina and her Lumas. And boy, if we're talking about simple but appealing, these star babies are the epitome of that. You could probably draw one in 3 seconds. They look like cake decorations, but their dialogue and some very endearing sound design sells them as actual characters with feelings. Less celebrated in the annals of Mario history is the debut in Galaxy of the Toad Brigade and its fearless leader, Captain Toad. In case you didn't realize, this is in fact the same character who later shows up in Super Mario 3D World, Super Mario Odyssey, and even his very own spin-off, a game which gives a lot of credence to my Polly Pocket theory about Super Mario 64. As I mentioned earlier, Captain Toad always puts a smile on my face when I see him in this game, but the cherry on top is his interactions with the other members of the brigade, which is why it's a shame that they don't show up nearly as often as he does. I think they deserve more recognition than they've received from Nintendo, so let's do a little roll call here and show them some appreciation. Male Toad! Glasses! What's-his-face? The Lazy One! Take a bow, all of you. You've earned it. And that's pretty much it for story stuff. As for aesthetic influences, Galaxy has a great art style, but not one that I would call definitive for future entries. In the field of music, on the other hand, it's probably worth noting Galaxy's use of a full symphony orchestra for some themes, which adds mountains of oomph to their aesthetic impact. You know, it just occurred to me that I didn't really talk about the music in either Super Mario 64 or Sunshine when I was discussing those games a few months ago. I guess that's because the soundtracks in those games, even when they're good, don't leave a huge impression on me. Frankly, I think 64's soundtrack isn't very good. It almost seems unfinished, with some tracks being reused in worlds they barely seem suited to. Check out Tick-Tock Clock, for instance. Sunshine uses a selection of pleasant, laid-back themes for its levels, and they're good, memorable even, but they don't stand out enough to be as impressive as tracks like Gusty Garden Galaxy, or even the Good Egg Galaxy in this game. Future Mario games have leaned pretty heavily on music to sell their style, so I think it's fair to credit Galaxy with starting this trend. It's not the first time Mario had great music, but it is the first time that a Mario game chose to define itself through music. As for enemies and gameplay, unfortunately, even though Galaxy was really creative in this area, relatively few of its innovations were held onto for future entries. The sole recurring enemy is the oddly named Electro Goomba, which reappeared in the bonus world of Super Mario 3D World, now called Octoomba. These Octorok-like nuisances do a respectable job as a spacey substitute for Goombas, and they would probably be more prominent, except that Galaxy is also full of regular Goombas, so Electro Goombas don't have much of a reason to exist. One thing that isn't an enemy, but is certainly a threat, is the Pulse Beam, a little robotic trap that sends out concentric laser beams which briefly stun and damage Mario. Super Mario Odyssey found room for a couple of these guys in its roster, which is nice because they do a lot to spice up otherwise dull moving platform sections. As far as Mario's own moveset is concerned, Galaxy reintroduced the long jump, which Sunshine had stripped out, but it didn't add much that was new. Spinning is quite a versatile addition here, but future games didn't see fit to make use of it, with the partial exception of Super Mario 3D World, in which playing as Rosalina allows you to perform a very similar mid-air spin. But that's not Mario using the spin, so it would be a stretch to count that. And we have two minor level elements that Galaxy introduced. The first is the idea of chasing after multicolored musical notes that hover in midair to unlock some objective or bonus. Odyssey was very fond of this particular gimmick, and used it in almost every world. Not present in Odyssey, but appearing in Super Mario 3D World, are flip switches, which change from blue to yellow when Mario treads on them, and allow progress when everyone in an area has been activated, signified by their turning bright green. Finally, we have general design, and to be honest, I'm drawing a blank on this one. It's not that there's anything wrong with Galaxy's overall mission structure or level design, it's just that as far as I can tell, future games took next to no inspiration from it. Even Galaxy 2, which you would expect to follow pretty closely in its forebear's footsteps, while it does use a lot of the same level design, has a very different overall structure. Where Sunshine was pretty inflexible in terms of which missions you had to do, and Galaxy was the most lenient of all the 3D Mario games, only demanding 60 out of the available 120 Power Stars, Galaxy 2 is, structurally speaking, a regression all the way back to the days of Super Mario Bros. 3, in which new worlds are unlocked just one or two at a time through a world map. And since there are fewer stars per galaxy, it's no longer possible to focus on the ones you like. You pretty much have to do a little of everything, just not 90% of everything, like in Sunshine. Future mainline Mario games went with this structure, rather than the more open-ended one found in Galaxy. Games like Super Mario 3D World would prove to be even more restrictive than Galaxy 2, making you play through the majority of stages, with just a few optional exceptions. And this is all the more curious in a series that, after Galaxy, never showed much interest in telling stories through its game design again. Linearity and storytelling work well together, but as the Mario games have become more linear over the last 15 years, they still haven't brought back the dramatic quality that distinguishes Sunshine and Galaxy. Being a compromise between structure and freedom, between straight-ahead fun and immersive storytelling, between innovative gameplay concepts and the good old-fashioned Mario level design, this is what made Super Mario Galaxy unique. But it also explains why it wasn't the kind of generation-defining success that New Super Mario Bros. Was. Galaxy sold well, considering how early it arrived in the Wii's lifespan, and its improvement over Sunshine's performance is probably what secured the continuation of 3D Mario, at a time when Nintendo had a strong incentive to make nothing but new Super Mario Bros. Games for the next decade. And yet, ironically, it was successful enough to justify a sequel made in almost exactly the same style, but not enough to justify further experimentation in the same vein as Galaxy. Sort of like what happened to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, now I come to think of it. Do you really think Tears of the Kingdom was the first Nintendo game to be designed as essentially a better version of one that already exists? An experience that's more enjoyable if you haven't played the game that it's ostensibly the sequel to, because it does basically all of the same things? No, of course not. In this vast universe, nothing is ever really done for the first time. It's all just a cycle of creation and destruction, stars pouring into a black hole until it spits out a massive stream of the same matter that went in, but in a subtly different configuration. All we can do is shrug our shoulders, look up to the sky, and say along with Mario, Welcome, New Galaxy!